Now, after finding out what the secret of the mimic was, I wanted to really analyze the info and lore the game gave us about the titular character, especially with Moon.EXE. So in this video, I will try to truly solve the mimic and find out how he works, why it acts the way it does, and how that affects the wider FNaF story. But right now, let's analyze what Secret of the Mimic tells us about the mimic. First, let's quickly recap the origins of the Murray family and the mimic. Edwin and Fiona met in MCM. They fall in love, they get married, and they eventually have a son named David. Just before David's 3rd birthday, Fiona went to help the Fall Fest crew with the installation. But unfortunately the attraction would be caught on fire and Fiona tragically dies. Now Edwin had to raise David on his own, but because Edwin was too busy with his work, he builds a robotic babysitter for David. He builds the Mimic, or as he calls it, M1. This Endo could wear any costume and become any character, simply by mimicking the things around it. David would grow attached to the robot and they become friends. One day, Edwin would be down in the tunnels and he would sometimes hear Fiona's voice echo through the walls. And so when he brings down a radio and sets the frequency to 4625, he hears Fiona repeating something she said in the past. So that leads me to believe that it's not actually Fiona's spirit, but just some of her memories. And so when Edwin discovered this, he taps M1 into that 4625 frequency. And the robot is flooded with Fiona's memories and personality, and it starts mimicking Fiona. On David's 5th birthday, David would play too close to the road and get hit by one of the cars. Edwin is devastated, but fake Fiona says that he could make another David, the same way he made another Fiona. And so Edwin tries several times to create M2 and make it copy David, but all of the copies failed, and so Edwin got frustrated and gave up on it, and beats M2 when it starts mimicking David. Fake Fiona tries to tell Edwin to try again, but Edwin finally realizes that he's gone too far, and none of this was his real family. He cuts contact with fake Fiona, and so M2 mimicked Edwin's rage and would kill anyone it sees. Now that's fine and dandy, but to better understand how the mimic works and what his goals are, we need to go back into Moon.EXE. In Moon.EXE, we start in a child's bedroom. The player is trapped and can't get out, and when we try to get out, Moon gets us and he puts us to sleep, something our player doesn't want to do ever again. Something to point out is that we can find a letter that reads, "Dear Moon, can you bring back the sun?" When we escape the bedroom and we're outside, we can save a baby owl from an angry gator. When we do, the baby owl becomes our friend. As we traverse through the dark forest, we find ancient ruins of what once was a happy home, in which the fire has blackened the walls. We see statues of Fiona and Edwin together, however Fiona's statue is burned. We eventually find ourselves in a broken down cabin. Inside the cabin you can find an old woman standing next to an oven. The old woman is called Sun, and she wants us to fix these 3 masks of Fredbear, Spring Bonnie, and Foxy. When we fix the masks, she gives us a special magical baby owl mask. And now the moon will think we are the baby owl. But suspiciously, when Sun gives us the owl mask, the baby owl is gone. When we ask about the baby owl, the old woman smiles. The baby owl flew away. But when we checked the stove that was previously cold and empty, was now very hot and is cooking something that smells like chicken. When we arrive at the cave and put on the baby owl mask, the moon takes one look at us and begins to cry. Inside the cave we find a statue of the baby owl, and the player says that we will bring him back no matter the cost. But as we traverse the abandoned underground city, we can find a broken moon statue. When we fix the broken moon statue, the statue sings and is reborn. It glows and then we are teleported into the welcome show. When we talk to Mr. Helpful, he says, "You rebuilt yourself, but now you are split in 2, moon and sun, destruction and life." We then traverse MCM and deal with the animatronics. Something to note, when we give Big Top the Fall Fest ticket, he says this: "This is the one. this is where the sun left, leaving them behind. As we defeat each animatronic, we are rewarded with David's toys, and when we reach David's room, we put his toys in the correct boxes and the closet door opens, and it shows us an upgrade machine. We upgrade our data diver, and Sun then appears from the sky and says, "You have found my presents. You have completed my tasks. Now you will get your reward. Use this to bring him back. It's all in your hands now." We then take the glitched permission. The glitched permission is yours. Use it wisely. The screen glitches as we see the several prizes we collected, the masks, as well as Sun, and they all shrink until it disappears. Now, there's a lot to unpack with this game, so I think the first thing we should do is identify the main characters. We know for a fact that Sun is F10N4, aka M1, the program that started out as a babysitter for David and then would hold some of Fiona's memories and remnant and be able to mimic her. So if Sun is Fiona, then Moon would most likely represent Edwin, not just because they are polar opposites, but because some of Moon's lines read like something Edwin would say. And since Moon cries when he sees us wear the baby owl mask, then the baby owl represents David. But I don't think it's just David, because interestingly, when Sun makes the baby owl mask, she seemingly kills the baby owl, and since I don't think M1 would ever do that, I think the owl more so represents the memory of David, because the baby owl was already dead for a long time. Because how else would Moon be able to make a tribute to the owl if the owl was just alive a few minutes before? I think the baby owl represents David's memory, and how F10 tried to use that memory to bring David back. But that wasn't enough, and that's why M2 failed. So since we try to become the baby owl, try to become David, then we play as M2. But unlike the other characters, we get to learn more about how M2 works and possibly see what he truly is and what it wants. To better understand what I mean, we have to look at the good ending. When we arrive to Murray's home, we can go through the glitched doors and find 6 bedtime story tapes. When we collect them all and insert them into the tape player, we enter David's room, and we activate the bedtime story. As the story plays out, M2 goes from mimicking David to being back to aggressive Mimic. But when we fully short-circuit Mimic, we are able to insert the glitched permission into M2, and when he reboots, he finally becomes the perfect copy of David. Like I said, the reason M1 was a perfect copy of Fiona was because it had some of Fiona's memories embedded into the code. But with M2, every copy failed because it didn't have those similar memories that belonged to David. That's why we collected the presents and put them in the game. These items hold some memories of David, and putting them all together was enough to make a perfect replica of him. Now that's not all, because to truly understand the good ending, we have to look back at Ruin and the Ruin daycare attendant. In Ruin, we find the Moon is in full control of the body, because Sun, as he says, is trapped in a nap. So that's why we can only see Sun in the AR world. Sun wanted Cassie to reboot him, because it can make them whole. And so when we glitch out Moon enough so he can't move, we move in and fix the robot. And when we do, Sun and Moon become one, the Eclipse. So going back to Secret of the Mimic, we see that the Mimic goes through the same thing. The Mimic Endo is said to be split in two, Moon and Sun, destruction on life. M1 being a copy of Fiona, the Sun, and M2 being a copy of Edwin, the Moon. And when we insert some of Sun's code that also had some of David's memories into M2, Sun and Moon are combined and they become an eclipse. But looking at it from the game itself, it looks like we are split after we built the Moon statue, because Helpful says that we are now split in two. And so if us building Moon is what created the split, then I think the real player of this game, in a metaphorical sense, is Sun. Not Fiona's son, but like the daycare attendant's son. And this makes a lot of sense because M2 at first was just a copy of M1's program. M2 at the start was by all means another son, without the remnants of Fiona's spirit. Furthermore, our player says that he wants to bring back the baby owl, no matter the cost. And that was the whole goal of M1. So if her code was copied over to M2, some of that code probably made M2 want to bring back David too, even though it was designed to be the new David. And then because Edwin beat M2 and poured his agony into it, the daycare son turns into the daycare moon. So instead of just two suns, there was just one sun and the moon. And notice that Helpful says that we rebuild ourselves just after we repaired the moon statue. The moon statue is the mimic Endo, and when Edwin beat it, it was broken, but the mimic put itself back together and was reborn into the new moon. I think Moon.EXE shows the progression of M2's learning. It at first was learning how to become the new David, and then it shows how it became its own thing later on. So to recap, Edwin made the Mimic Endo and the Mimic 1 code. Edwin discovered that some of Fiona's remnant was in the tunnels. Edwin tapped M1 into that 4625 frequency, and M1 became Fiona, aka Sun. Then David dies, and M1 convinced Edwin to make another David. Edwin copied M1's program as a baseline for the M2 code, and because of that, M2 had some of the memories of M1, and the desire to bring back David. Sun tried to make M2 the perfect copy of David, but none of the M2s were successful. They mimicked David's actions, but they were never really thinking and acting like him. That was because M2 didn't have that paranormal influence that M1 had. After many failed tests, Edwin realizes he's gone too far, and didn't want to make another M2, and later on he would beat the Endo. M2 now learned violence, and instead of mimicking David, M2 mimicked Edwin, and essentially became his dark reflection, the new moon, and it wreaked havoc on MCM. And now that we've got that figured out, let's talk about what happened after M2 became violent, and arguably the most confusing part of Secret of the Mimic's story, that being the timeline of the creation of M2 and the cradle. See, when M2 became aggressive, M1 sent Edwin blueprints for a cradle. As she says, the cradle will keep David/M2 safe and provide boundaries. If Edwin wasn't going to finish the program, then he can build the cradle to keep people safe. She describes the cradle as a computer that is bigger than anything Edwin has built. When we arrive at Edwin's office, we find a terminal called Mechanical X-Form Experimental Storage No. 1, or M.X.E.S for short. This experimental storage contained the cradle program, and we see this cradle program in action in Ruin. But notice how in Help Wanted 2, we activate the M.X.E.S machine when we type 4625, the same frequency Edwin used to find Fiona. So by all intensive purposes, the F10 machine is the M.X.E.S machine. And notice how this storage device has Mechanical X-Form in its name. I bring this up because Edwin's computer in MCM that contained Mimic's blueprints is called Experimental Storage 2. It didn't have the Mechanical X-Form in its name. So the storage No. 1 isn't just holding the cradle program, it also held the M1, which makes sense when you realize that M1 is stored in Storage 1 and M2's blueprints are stored in Storage 2. The only difference is that M1 as a whole is stored in Storage 1, and that's why it has M.X.E in its name. And quick side note, M1 is definitely not stored in Storage 2 like some people think, because she would just be able to access the Mimic blueprints by herself and the plot of the game wouldn't even happen. So yeah, she is definitely in Storage 1. Okay, F10 is M.X.E.S, so what's the big deal? Well, notice in the message that M2 started acting aggressive and yet the M.X.E.S machine isn't built yet. So if M1 wasn't in the machine yet, then was she still in her original Mimic Endo? Because if that's the case, then is M2 a whole different Mimic Endo? That's what I found really confusing, because if M1 wasn't in the M.X.E.S machine yet, while M2 was killing people, then what is she stored in? That left me with two options. Either A, M2 is a whole different robot and M1 stayed in its original body until M.X.E.S was built, or M1 was stored in a different machine before M.X.E.S, while Edwin used the original Endo for the M2 program. Now with option A, if M1 was a different Endo to M2, then where would that Endo be? It's possible that it could be in the F10 machine, but I also thought of a different possibility. M1 could be Moon. Now, we don't know a whole lot about Moon. We know that he was the main attraction in the Storytime showroom, and it is a mascot suit that people would wear. But an accident would occur where the giant moon head would collapse from the showroom and land in basement 1, dropping the Sleepy Moon costume along with it. When we arrive at basement 1, we find a mail from an employee who was trapped in the basement, saying that he was stuck down there and he was starving. So that led people to speculate that the starved employee dies inside the moon costume, and his undead corpse would roam around the basement. But here's the thing, this theory isn't as tight-knit as you think, and that has to do with why the employee was trapped in the first place. See, when Clarence, one of the workers, went down into basement 1, he says that he found out why the place was closed in the first place, and that's because something was down there. So the workers closed the place up and trapped the worker in there because Moon was already lurking in the basement. So while I think the starved employee could be Sleepy Moon, I think there is a possibility that it's not. And assuming that the starved worker isn't inside the moon suit, then who is? Well, what if it was the M1 Endo? After Fiona was placed in the cradle machine, the M1 Endo was left abandoned. Now that it didn't have Fiona's soul or her remnant, the Endo was back as David's babysitter, the original program before it mimicked Fiona. However, there is a timeline issue with this, because in the same mailbox that had M1's message about the cradle blueprints, has M1 say that they are losing their home. So this mail was sent after all the workers had already left and MCM was going down, and so no one would be able to encounter the M1 Endo wearing the moon suit. So I find it more likely that if M1 was in the Endo until the F10 machine was built, then I think the Endo is inside the machine. But what about option B? Well, if M1 was transferred in another machine before F10, then Edwin would have been able to use the same Endo to put in the M2 program. But if that's the case, what machine did Edwin store M1 in? Well, I think it's possible that M1 was stored in Edwin's personal computer, the experimental storage number 1. I think this storage device could have existed before the cradle was built, and it was made to house M1. Similar to the second experimental storage, this terminal didn't need a large computer for it to work, so the experimental storage number 1 could have held M1 without needing the F10 machine. But when M2 caused problems and Edwin made the F10 machine, M.X.E.S was turned into a supercomputer and now holds M1 and the cradle program. So if that's the case, then there wouldn't be any need for 2 mimic endos to be out there. Which kinda has to be the case because Moon.EXE shows us how only one thing was split into 2 personalities. So M1 and M2 being different endos entirely defeats the purpose of that line and the connection to the daycare attendant. But for fun, if there were 2 mimic endos and M1 was stored in M.X.E.S before M2 was even made, then that could fix the problem we had with Sleepy Moon being the M1 endo. Because if fake Fiona was transferred into a computer not long after David's death, then the M1 endo would have time to become faulty over time, like Edwin's other inventions, and would eventually drop down to basement 1 wearing the moon costume, and the workers would be still present to close it down. But personally, I think it's more likely that there was just one mimic endo. And that's it for this video, but I'm not done just yet, because this video acts as a part 1 of my mimic analysis video. So now that we better understand Mimic.EXE's character, history, and how he works, in the next video, we will see how it affects the future, and how it changes the context of the previous games. So I hope to see you in part 2. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, all that jazz, and I'll see you on the flip side.